Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, I guess I want to say thank you to the CIMM members who have been incredibly engaged participants in this effort. What we're going to do today is this is not a report out about what we have learned. This is a update as to what we are learning. We are very much in the thick of trying to answer the questions which we set off to, which we'll get to in a minute. But as we kicked off this project, the key members, including Disney, Viacom, Turner, SMG, ESPN, Analect, Google, and others, we set some parameters at the beginning of how do we run this in a transparent way, how do we work collaboratively and iteratively, realizing that to try to measure the individual behaviors of children and youth across media is a fairly daunting task. And it's going to require a lot of feedback and learning, which is what we've undertaken over the last while since we kicked off this project last fall. And with that, kind of why is it that this TiVo and RealityMine are tackling this project? At the heart of it, I think it's really because this is not as much a research task as it's a technology task. To answer these questions, it's really about how do you have the right tools to capture data across this incredible set of devices which everyone's consuming media now. And we'll get into more into detail. But after the capturing it, how do you process the data and how do you turn that into a rich picture? And that's been as much the challenge as anything in what we're doing here. And so as we set out to answer these core questions around how are children consuming media across these platforms, what's the source of viewership, and how does that vary across ages 2 to 5, 6 to 11, or 12 to 17, and there's certainly obviously clear differences, just what are they? And that's what we've been trying to do. So let's just explain to you all what the methodology is we've been following, and we'll get then into details of what we've been learning and some views on the kind of data we're getting out. So first, in terms of the detail, obviously we could do very simply household measurement, and in fact, right now I could report you beautiful, very interesting data about what goes on in the households that we're looking at. Or we could have taken a device-centric approach, and that also, on the plethora of devices we're measuring, we could give you incredibly detailed information, but what everyone said is, okay, let's actually go for the individual. Let's go for a human-centric measurement. And how do we do this at scale? And in fact, we, TiVo, RealityMine, both are doing the first two things at scale. We're both, TiVo has millions of households. RealityMine last year collected millions of people's data passively. But it's a challenge of how do we do this at an individual level of children and youth and try to do that at scale in this environment. And so with that, we set up at the very beginning a very high target of the kinds of people we wanted to measure. So it wasn't just getting children 2 to 5 to participate. It was having very tech-heavy households at the beginning to really make sure we could test actually just measuring everything. So we had to have TiVos in the house, obviously. We're working with the PowerWatch panel. We had to have people using some sort of OTT device, be it Apple TV, Chromecast, Roku, etc. They had to have some sort of game station, Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, etc., computers, mobile phones, and tablets. So they had to have all that stuff to qualify to begin with, and they had to have some kids and be willing to do all of this. So it's been a fairly heavy-duty recruit at the beginning. As we go on to the next phase, we're relaxing that a little bit, but still looking for people have a lot of technology in their homes. And how we're measuring it looks like this. So on one end, very intensive panel management, recruiting people from TiVo's PowerWatch panel, making sure they're COPPA compliant. We're opting them in very explicitly, getting lots of permissions to share all this data we're taking. And it obviously requires a fairly high degree of panel management. Then there's all these tools to capture all the data from all these devices across TVs and OTT devices and game stations and tablets and mobile phones and PCs, et cetera. And we also, so we're using data from the set-top box, audio content recognition, a router meter, which captures things that we can't put another meter on, and then device meters across all that. So all of these different devices, all funneling data into the next step of actually turning this all into some semblance of data through the processing and deduplication, and then finally presenting some individual viewer behaviors on the back of all that. There's one piece of this whole thing, which is a non-passive tool, which is a little check-in app, and because it's really hard to attribute viewership of a device or TV still to individuals, and we'll talk more about that, because this is one of the weak links in the whole process around passively, behaviorally attributing all this viewership. And if we kind of go into, just to give you a sense of the kind of data we're capturing. So from a TV perspective, we are capturing programs and promotions and ads, but we're really focusing on sort of program and platform level data. But in fact, in order to understand that, we have to actually not just triangulate, but quadrangulate to get to this data. And we need to put together pieces from the set-top box, from audio content recognition, from the router meter, and from the device meters, all together to figure out, is someone actually just watching linear TV? Are they watching something over Netflix? Are they watching something streaming from their tablet to the TV? Are they watching something through their PlayStation? All these things requires a lot of information and figuring out what actually is a real positive versus a false positive, or more importantly, we have a lot of false negatives, or sorry, we have a lot of gaps in the data where we can't positively attribute it to an individual. So there's huge holes right now which we're working on how do we fill in. And that goes down to the device level data. We put meters on all these devices in the home, their tablets, PCs, laptops, and that gets all the sort of stuff you'd expect, web and app and social and search usage, get program detail, and ultimately we can see more. We capture 180 other metrics, location data, data speeds, a pile of things which aren't appropriate for this project, but can start to lend ways to start to see behavior and attribution to more things beyond just media consumption. Meanwhile, in the router meter, we're using this, and this is a key piece of the whole project, to be able to get all the stuff we can't put a meter on. So the router meter lets us be very clear on what's happening on the game stations, on the smart TVs, on the Apple TVs, et cetera, and get all that data through. So again, it goes back to that quadrillate, by able to, quadrillate. I can't even use my own word I've made up here today. Sorry. Okay, all right. So who are we actually measuring? There's a pretty interesting mix of people here. So just to give you a flavor, for the first 100 households, it's just a snapshot of what kinds of people we're measuring. Average household is 3 to 4 people. We've got some outliers, bigger families, even a household of 9 people. 1 to 2 children on average, but some bigger families. Household income skews a little bit higher, as you'd expect. We've been focusing on these more tech-forward people with lots of devices. But I do think that the stats here in the upper right-hand corner are particularly interesting, because there we have this incredible number of devices in the household. On average, 12.5 devices are being used in the households we're measuring. So there's a lot of things. And if we look a little bit more just at the landscape, the topography of those devices, these bubbles are sized to show you how many of any given kind of devices. And there's really a pile of different things there. Lots of houses have multiple game stations. You see lots of different kinds of iPhones from very old to very new, and Android devices, lots of different kinds of tablets, lots of different kinds of PCs in use. So it's a very, very heterogeneous ecosystem that we're trying to measure. And this doesn't even look at all the OTT devices and others. I just didn't have room on the slide for all those things. And we're measuring people across the country. So this is the PowerWatch panel has been delivering us a really good mix of people all over the world, all over the US. But it's not been without challenges. So very high level, what are those challenges? Well, the first one is making sure people are compliant, because we do have this one step of having this little check-in app to attribute things like broadcast viewing. And these are my kids, and we've been participating and getting my kids to make sure they're very diligent. But my little guy here, he loves taking the iPad and taking off somewhere and hiding and not showing it. Does he want to check in then? No, because he knows we're analyzing all the data. And I can't help but think my kids are like most other kids. How do we improve that? We'll talk more about some things we're doing to make even that part of the process passive, and I think that will have a big positive implication. The other big challenge has been, we've really seen this over the last couple of years, a big change in attitudes towards privacy. And obviously, Edward Snowden releasing all the data he did, the battles between the FBI and Apple and whatnot, suddenly brings a different level of awareness. And we've seen this in the reasons why some people are choosing to opt out, even after they've said everything. When they actually go and set up all the gear in their own homes, they're like, do I really want to do this? And we see some people coming up with reasons, well, I'm not so sure if my employer is happy for me to have work email going through all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And that's something we've become very acutely aware of. And then the final challenge is really just putting all this data together, because it is so much data, so many different devices, and it's again, we're trying to ensure that every bit of data we have can be attributed to an individual's behavior and not just household level, not just device stuff. It's really about how do we match it right back to people. But we do have some data. So with this, I have to put an enormous health warning. This is not results, this is not currency, this is just to start to show you the kinds of data we're producing. So please don't anyone have a fit about this matching up to Nielsen numbers or not. There's no effort whatsoever to try to do that. But we do start to see some interesting things. So just stacking up, for example, and I'll explain to you the kinds of challenges we have. So just to get away from numbers, we've indexed this to 100%, and kind of how does this all split out? But we see some of the challenges in attributing viewing. So for example, with streaming, The streaming number here is lower than it should be, but it's because the number of false negatives we have here, without being certain that something is being streamed, we can see different streaming activity going on through the router, but it may not be picked up by ACR, it may not be picked up on another. There's lots of different ways around how we may not have all the data and attribute it back to a person that we can say, okay, this was definitely a child streaming content at this given time. In the same way, if we look at a share of streaming video specifically down to Netflix, YouTube, and other, now, again, these are not shares of the market or anything of the sort. What's interesting is how you have to work to detect what's going on. And everyone goes to great efforts. Well, actually, I wouldn't say go to great. The engineers at any of the platforms providing content couldn't care less probably about what we're trying to do to figure out what's going on. They may care, and certainly it's all changing. And so for us to understand what content is being streamed from YouTube or Netflix or Hulu or whatever is a great game at actually understanding details in the code, which is no one's saying, hey, this is a Netflix show, and this is it is. It's actually, so unearthing, putting that all together into a very rich picture, and again, then linking it back to, is that stream just going to a piece of glass which is turned off, but it happens to be running or not? There's lots of ways to make sure that, again, that to actually attribute this to an individual is really the heart of the challenge. And we see that again with some other data here looking at younger kids to older kids about how their device use changes over the course of the week by group. I do think some of these things are interesting, though. We definitely see some things where young kids just are not using PCs, PCs in particular, laptops to view content. That just seems to be a big hole. So there's some things here we can start to see very clearly. Or if we look across the mix of sharing across devices more widely, again, changes before weekday or weekend. We see that things like, again, tablet and smartphone numbers we know are small here now. Again, the problem of false negatives. We cannot directly attribute some of the stuff yet. And so this is part of our challenge of how do we improve that. But we do start to see some interesting patterns, too, about the kinds of usages over the week and how these things fit together. And this picture starts to make a little bit more sense in terms of we see kinds of peaks you'd expect during the week, but also the kinds of devices and how those are being used in the mix, as well as what happens on the weekend, where we get more steady state use of all these different things over the course of the day. So finally, in my last few seconds here, we're on now to really take this to the next step. And I look forward to being able to report out some actual findings with you guys all in the near future. But as we do that, there's four things that we're focused on improving to turn this from being a piece of R&D into being something which everyone can use for real insights. And the first is clearly we need to get rid of the false negatives. So the improvement of content matching, about improving panelist compliance and viewer attribution are really the heart of the challenge right now, so that by the next time we come back, the data will be a lot more robust, and those places where things look thin will actually be the proper volumes. And with that, there's some things we're doing. So for example, we're going to be piloting idea of passive audience detection, and there's some very interesting tools out there which will help us be able to attribute things to people. And with that, we can actually hopefully fill in those gaps and actually know who's actually watching TV and who's not, who's actually on a tablet and who's not, as opposed to having people check in. The final piece about this is it's been really quite an expensive undertaking. And one of the things we're trying to work on as we do this is how do we ultimately improve the economics, because this is great to get data, but data we all know that data at any cost is not on the table. And so how do we also think about creating to apply more gamification around this, make it more interesting for people so that we can actually make it something people want to participate in. And that's something else that we're experimenting with more. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'm certainly welcome to answer any questions you might have afterwards about the project. Thanks for your time.